So you know how you sent me all those news articles about Australia and how they're dealing with social media these days?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is going to be super interesting to really dig into. It's like all about, well, a lot of it is about TikTok specifically and Australia kind of figuring out what to do.
It is. It is. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting case study because they're right on the front lines of this whole thing. How governments and societies try to deal with, I mean, these are massive, huge global platforms. It's not easy.
Right. And it's changing all the time, too. So, like, for everyone listening, think of this as your cheat sheet to understanding the whole situation down under.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is, like, go through all those articles you sent and pull out, like, the most important stuff,
Yeah.
especially about how the Australian government's been reacting to TikTok, what the privacy issues are, and this big new law they passed. Oh, and to be clear, we're talking about news articles you sent me.
Exactly. We're going straight to the source.
Straight to the source. Okay, so like right off the bat, back in April 2023, the Australian government made a pretty big decision about TikTok, specifically on government devices. Do you remember what happened?
Oh, yeah, April 2023, that was a big one. They basically just banned it outright. No TikTok on any phones, tablets, computers, anything the government issued.
Just a straight up ban.
It
Wow.
was pretty decisive. And the main reason they gave was national security. There's this underlying concern that, TikTok gathers so much data from its users, like where you are, what you're doing on the app, even like metadata. And there's this fear that some of that data could end up in the hands of foreign governments.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Data security is a huge deal, especially for governments.
Absolutely. And, this move by Australia wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was very much in line with what a lot of their allies were doing, especially the Five Eyes countries, the US, UK, Canada, New
Oh,
Zealand.
yeah, right, the Intelligence Alliance.
Exactly. And many of them had already made similar moves against TikTok. So it shows there's a lot of shared concern about these apps and, the potential for data to be misused.
So Australia basically said, we're with you guys on this one. We're not taking any chances. And this idea of where data is going and who controls it, that's what people call data sovereignty, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of this conversation. It's the idea that countries should have control over the data that's generated within their own borders so they can, protect their citizens and their national interests.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the federal government in Australia either.
Oh, you mean like individual states were taking action too?
Yeah, like Tasmania, for example, they were one of the states that were looking at banning TikTok on their government devices, too. They even made an official announcement about it.
So it sounds like there was a pretty consistent message across different levels of government in Australia, right?
Yeah, like a sort of better safe than sorry approach when it comes to government data. Even though everyday Aussies could still use TikTok on their own phones, they were drawing a line when it came to official devices.
Makes sense. But okay, so we've been talking about government stuff, but what about regular people? Were the concerns about data security in TikTok only focused on government devices, or was there more to it?
Well, here's the thing. The scrutiny on TikTok didn't stop there. It went way beyond government devices. TikTok's entire approach to data in Australia started getting a lot of attention, and not in a good way.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, the Australian privacy watchdog, they actually launched a full-blown inquiry into how TikTok collects and uses personal data. They wanted to see if the company was playing by the rules, and what they found was, well, let's just say, pretty concerning.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
What did they find?
One of the things that really raised red flags was TikTok's use of tracking pixels. And that's a whole other can of worms.
Okay, for those of us who aren't, like, tech experts, break it down. What are tracking pixels, and why were people freaking out about them?
Right, so imagine these tiny little pieces of code that are hidden on websites and even other apps. They're invisible to you when you're browsing, but they're working in the background, collecting information about what you're doing online. And that information gets sent back to TikTok, even if you don't even use TikTok or have an account.
So, like, even if I've never downloaded TikTok in my life, they could still be tracking what I'm doing online.
Potentially, yeah. It's a way for TikTok to build up this huge profile of your online habits, your interests, what you click on, even if you're not directly interacting with their app.
Whoa, that's kind of creepy. And what about people who do use TikTok? I mean, we all know social media apps collect data. What was so different about what TikTok was doing?
You see, a lot of people don't realize that those tracking pixels could be operating on all sorts of websites, not just TikTok. So it's not just about what you're doing on the app itself. It's like they're creating this much bigger picture of your online behavior, where you go, what you look at, what you're interested in.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's a whole other level of data collection.
Exactly. And that raised some big questions about privacy and consent. Like, how much data is too much data? And are people really aware of what they're agreeing to when they use these platforms? The Australian authorities definitely thought it was going too far.
So it sounds like there was a lot of concern brewing in Australia about data security and just the overall impact of social media. And then in November 2024, they passed this pretty major law that was all about protecting kids online. What can you tell us about that?
Right, so this new law basically says that kids under 16 can't access certain social media platforms. And yeah, TikTok is one of them, as well as Facebook and Snapchat, some of the big ones.
So no more scrolling through TikTok for teenagers under 16.
That's the idea. The government really wanted to protect young people from what they see as potential harms from these platforms. You know, things like cyberbullying, exposure to inappropriate content, that kind of thing.
And it sounds like they were serious about enforcing it too, right? I remember reading about some pretty hefty fines for companies that don't comply.
Yeah, they weren't messing around. The law said that companies could be fined up to 50 million Australian dollars if they don't take steps to keep kids under 16 off their platforms. That's a serious motivator to follow the rules.
50 million, wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
Definitely a strong message. But, like any big new law, it wasn't without its critics. There were a lot of people who raised valid concerns about the ban and how effective it would really be.
Like what kind of concerns?
Well, one of the main worries was that it might actually make things worse for some kids. The thinking is, if teenagers can't access the mainstream platforms, the ones everyone knows about, where are they going to go?
Right, they're not just going to suddenly stop going online.
Exactly. They're probably going to end up on smaller platforms, ones that maybe don't have the same safety measures in place, the ones that aren't being as closely watched. And that could actually expose them to more risks. You know, things like harassment, misinformation, even scams. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. You try to shut down one thing and something else pops up somewhere else.
That makes sense. It's hard to control what happens online. And then there's the whole question of age verification. I mean, how can you actually prove how old someone is online?
Yeah, that's a big one. Like, do you ask for ID? What if that information gets hacked? It's a tricky balance between protecting kids and also protecting their privacy.
Right, because you don't want to solve one problem by creating another one. And then on top of all the practical challenges, there's also the social side of things to consider. I mean, teenagers use social media to connect with their friends, share their lives. There's a worry that this ban could make some kids feel even more isolated, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. This is a generation that's grown up with social media. It's how they communicate, how they build relationships. And for some kids, it's their main source of support, especially if they're going through tough times. So taking that away, even with the best intentions, could have unintended consequences. It's like a double-edged sword. You're trying to protect them, but you also don't want to cut them off from their world.
It's so complicated, right? There's no easy answer.
Not at all. It's a constant balancing act, but it's a conversation we need to have. Okay, now what about the tech companies themselves? Like, how did they react to all this?
Well, from what I read, they seem to be willing to at least try to comply with this under 16 ban.
Yeah, they've made public statements saying they're on board with the goal of protecting kids, but they also have a lot of concerns about how it's all going to work in practice.
What?
Well, the biggest one is just the sheer scale of it all. I mean, think about how many people use these platforms. It's a massive undertaking to try and verify the age of every single user. And then there's the question of privacy. They're worried about having to collect even more personal data to prove people's ages, which could create new security risks.
So it's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They want to cooperate, but they also don't want to compromise user privacy or, like, create a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. It's a really tough spot to be in. And speaking of solutions, there was one development that I thought was super interesting. Apple, they're apparently working on new tech that could potentially make age verification a lot easier and less intrusive.
Really?
What is it? It's an API, basically, a set of tools that developers can use to verify a user's age range right within their apps. So instead of each platform having to come up with their own system, which could be really messy and inconsistent, it would all be handled through the operating system, through iOS in this case.
Also, it's like a more standardized, centralized approach.
Exactly, and that could be huge because it means users wouldn't have to share as much personal information with every single app they use. It would be more streamlined, more secure, and hopefully more privacy-friendly.
It sounds promising. So to kind of sum all this up, what we're seeing in Australia is a country that's really taking social media regulation seriously. They've got the ban on government devices, the privacy watchdog looking into data collection, and this new law to protect kids. It's a multi-pronged approach for sure.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And all of these actions together, they really show just how worried people are getting about data security, about the power these platforms have, and especially about the impact on young people. And it's not just Australia either. This is a conversation that's happening all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's trying to figure out how to deal with these platforms and how to balance, like, freedom of expression with the need to protect people. It's a tough one.
It really is. And it's only going to get more complex as technology continues to evolve. But I think the key takeaway here is that we need to be having these conversations. We need to be thinking critically about how we use these platforms, what information we're sharing, and what kind of world we want to create online.
And I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with. Thank you for this deep dive. It's been eye-opening. And for everyone listening, we hope this has given you some food for thought.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's definitely worth paying attention to.
It definitely is. Think about the choices you make online, the information you share, and the impact it can have. We all have a role to play in shaping this digital world.
Well said. Thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive.